Thanks for listening to Creative Control. While I have you here, please consider supporting Youth Empowerment and Support Services, otherwise known as YES. Based in Edmonton, Alberta, YES provides immediate and low-barrier overnight and day shelter, temporary supportive housing, and individualized wraparound supports for young people aged 15 to 24. They work collaboratively within a network of care focused on the prevention of youth homelessness by providing youth with the necessary supports to stabilize their housing, improve their well-being, build life skills, connect with community, and avoid re-entry into homelessness. Learn more about how to donate or otherwise support YES by visiting yess.org.
Creative control, creative control. Comedy, art, and sometimes rock and roll. Let's do a public opinion poll. Raise your hand if you love creative control. 'Cause when Vish is unleashed, well, Oh, sorry, I didn't see you there. I was just working on a tribute song to my favorite podcast, Creative Control, with Vish Khanna. My name is Matthias, and I play in a band called The Burning Hell, but more importantly, I support Creative Control on Patreon, and I think you should too. Quality long-form arts journalism is like a magical talking unicorn. It definitely exists, but it can be really hard to find. Fortunately for us, Vish makes it easy with hundreds of funny, thought-provoking, well-researched and engaging interviews with artists from all over the world. Your flexible monthly donation on Patreon will get you plenty of special exclusive treats and help Vish keep his podcast well-fed and cared for properly, the way a magical unicorn deserves.
To make your flexible monthly donation to Creative Control, please visit patreon.com/Creative Control today.
Shawn Michaels is a talented, award-winning novelist and influential music writer who is based in Montreal, Quebec. Renowned for founding the essential music blog Said the Gramophone, Michaels' non-fiction work has appeared in The New Yorker, The Guardian, The Globe and Mail, and Pitchfork, among other outlets. His debut novel, Us Conductors, was published in 2014 and earned him Canada's coveted literary award, the Scotiabank Giller Prize, and he has also received the Quebec Writers Federation's Paragraph Hugh MacLennan Prize, as well as the Prix Nouvelle Écriture. His third novel takes on Silicon Valley and artificial intelligence and their role in shaping our emotional and intellectual connections to artistic expressions like poetry. The lovely, compelling book is called Do You Remember Being Born and was published by Penguin Random House on September 5th, 2023. Shawn returns to this show to discuss things like our first meeting in the Yukon Territory and a memorable helicopter ride we shared to view the Tombstone Mountains, his interest in the unlikely pop culture ascendance of the 20th century American poet Marianne Moore and her influence on the protagonist he conjured for his new novel, his fascination, exploration, and use of ChatGPT and artificial intelligence to write this book, what folks like Nick Cave and Mark Maron may not be understanding about such technology, the art of collaboration, upcoming book tour dates, other future plans, and much more. A part of the Entertainment One network with the support of listeners just like you who follow and subscribe to this donor-driven podcast and spread the word about it, and make flexible monthly donations at patreon.com/Creative Control. This is the primary source of revenue for all the work that goes into making this show for you each week. So if you have the means and the time to donate to this show, I'd appreciate it. Again, visit patreon.com/Creative Control to learn more about how you can do that. Plus in-kind support from the likes of Pizza Trocadero, The Bookshelf, and Planet Bean Coffee in Guelph, Ontario, and Grandad's Donuts in Hamilton, Ontario, all wonderful independent businesses. This is episode 798 of Creative Control, featuring the lovely and talented Shawn Michaels, with your host, me, Vish Khanna. Hey, Sean, how's it going?
It's good. Vish, how are you?
I'm pretty well, thank you very much. Where in the world are you?
I'm in Montreal, Quebec, Canada.
Nice. How are things going in Montreal?
You know what? I think things are going well in Montreal. I feel like 8 months ago, I wasn't so sure, but now the summer's here, I really feel convinced that Montreal remains a fantastic place to be. So I'm happy here.
What was 8 months ago, roughly? What was happening?
I mean, I guess it was the winter. But I mean, there was coming out of COVID and, you know, with gentrification here and all, I think there are still a lot of reasons to wonder, like, is Montreal on its way out? But I'm feeling optimistic about its role in the Canadian and international, I don't know, sweepstakes of where to live in the world and where the quality of life is good.
I was going to ask about this, like if you're contemplating Montreal's status, where do you look to as an alternative? Yeah.
With all due respect, there's nowhere in Canada, not for me.
Yeah, that's fine. That's where I was getting to, and we have these kinds of conversations with people all the time. A lot of people talk about how they've moved in the last few years from wherever they were, whether it was from a smaller place to a bigger place, but more often I think it's people moving from a larger city like Montreal or Toronto to some outpost in Canada. You haven't gone that far in your contemplation. No. Okay. Yeah. No,
I mean, I'm too much of a big city person, but I think a lot of people are, and it can come down really very much to dollars and cents. And it's hard. Can be a hard life in 2023 to make all that add up.
Yeah. And then, people look to the coasts, and I always say, well, the water frightens me because of the ocean and the climate. And then as we're speaking right now, Sean, I'm going to be taking in relatives from Yellowknife who are being forced to evacuate because of the wildfires. They're driving down to Alberta, Calgary and Edmonton and various places. And so that's, Anyway, it's bleak.
Yeah, Vish, whenever I think, like when I heard the terrible news about Yellowknife, I just think of Dawson City, which is the closest I've been to there. It's still pretty far away. Mm-hmm. And we were there together, Dawson City.
That's where you and I met.
Oh, is it?
It's literally where we met. You knew of me from our mutual friend Kit Mallow, as I recall. Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned it when you found out that we were among the sort of journalists who were there. It's weird. I just told a little bit of this story to Nina Nastasia, who was on the show. Yeah, well,
I haven't listened to her episode yet.
Oh well, I'm
a huge fan.
Yeah, it's a bit of a tough episode, as you may be aware of her recent circumstances, but it was also very refreshingly forthright, and there was joy in it somehow, and that's what I pick up from her album. But I made a side note, a joke, because Nina at the time, I think she may be gone back to the States, had been living in Calgary, doing like an arts residency and collaborating with some people. And my joke was something like, I'm in Edmonton. We are about a 3.5 hour drive away from each other, or a quick helicopter ride. And that was just a little comment I made. And then we talked about Succession and how everyone takes a helicopter everywhere. And because I'm still, I guess, currently rewatching the entire series, which I believe you're a fan of, right? Or you watched it. I don't know. Can anyone be a fan of these people on that show?
Indeed, yeah.
You were following
a fan and a critic.
We had a minor exchange about it as people were trying to predict who would succeed in Succession.
Yes.
And I predicted it was what's his name? I'm already blanking on the guy's name. The Connor. The con heads, I thought.
Yes.
And you quickly were like,
and mine was for I was in Team Greg will win. I was in that team.
You and
very mistaken.
You and I picked the wrong horses in that race. But anyway, talking about helicopters.
But Vish, helicopter.
Yeah.
Because we went in a helicopter ride.
I told the story, and this is great. I want to get to this because sometimes I worry that I'm telling old stories wrong nowadays. I don't know why, but every once in a while someone will be like, who knows? We'll say, actually. And I'm like, anyway. Here's what I remember, Sean. You tell me. We got in a helicopter, and they gave us those headsets with the microphones. Correct?
Yeah.
Right. So we take off, and we head into the mountain range.
The Tombstone Mountains, I believe.
Wow, you remember that. Yeah. So this is great. You're going to remember everything. Okay, I didn't remember that. So we go to the mountains, and as I recall, on the way out, we're all kind of chatty. Hey, look at this. What's going on? And then what I told Nina is on the way back, I noticed it was eerily quiet. And that's my memory. And I remember the visceral sensation of feeling queasy, a little nauseous. Yeah. And I think the helicopter had done a circle or something.
Yeah.
And anyway, then when we landed, I told Nina that when I checked in with people, everyone was like, yeah, I didn't feel that great on the way back. Does any of that resonate with you? Do you remember more quiet or sickly feelings on the way back?
I don't have a recall of like nausea, but but I don't recollect that it definitely wasn't the case. But I do know that the experience was very memorable and visceral for me. In fact, like in this new book I've written, there's a couple of allusions to helicopters.
Yes.
And to the joy of traveling by helicopter. I think a character says that it was just this amazing way, just this hurtling forward way of traveling that she adores. And that is directly inspired by that trip, because my takeaway from our helicopter adventure to the Tombstone Mountains was that it was wicked, that it was so cool. And I don't mean necessarily that the whole trip was. It could well have been that there was this turning point where things got queasy, and because I sometimes have motion sickness. But I remember the outward journey and reaching the mountains and just like the incredible feeling of being almost in like a 360-degree plunging into beauty that was really striking, really amazing.
I remember those things too. I remember it being quite majestic and even in the moment feeling really fortunate, because I believe we were on the tab of like, I don't know,
the Yukon Tourism Board or something.
Yes, they were. There was no reason. It had nothing to do with the music festival we were brought to sort of attend and cover. They were just like, "Do you want to get in a helicopter?" And we were like, "Okay." And then we went, and it was great. I really enjoyed that trip, and wonder if I'll ever. I guess I'm closer to it now, but it just seemed like a once in a lifetime.
Maybe you'll one day
thing.
have to flee forest fires north to Dawson City.
Man, if people from the
what a funny joke.
If people from the frigid territories, I suppose, are having to flee fires, then I think that's probably a bad sign. So I don't know what's going to happen, and where we've talked. There was a period in May of 2023 where it was in the air here. The notion that we may have to in Edmonton evacuate. So people are like, where would we go? And I think I would just head back to Ontario.
Yeah,
I would. Yeah. I don't know what else I would do, but helicopters would be handy. Anyway, weirdly bleak and fun recall of our first meeting, and it's nice to have you back on the show. Congratulations on this book. Do you remember being born? I'm holding an arc of it here, showing it to Sean. Everyone, congratulations, Sean. How are you feeling? Getting another book done. I can't relate to this sensation. What is it like to be like, it's done? It's circulating. How do you feel?
It does. There's like an old line about having children is like having like one of the organs of your body wandering around outside on its own pair of legs. And there's an element of that to having a book newly in the world. It really feels like something that I feel very vulnerable about and worried for, and kind of want to protect and keep safe and like nourish and teach to walk and run. But it just could be, it's wandering around out there and could get hit by a bus. Like there's really that feeling.
It's the perception for a book is that the author, has spent a solitary amount of time working on something, like a secret. And then they bring in my knowledge of how these things work, that's not exactly the case. You have editors, you have people you share things with, right?
Well, I mean, with a work of fiction, there's like, you don't usually, certainly in my case, there's no editor involved until the book is almost done. Because you don't sell the book until it's pretty far advanced. I do have an agent who saw, a second or third draft of the book, but there's sort of years of work before anyone professional has seen it. And in my case, a couple of one or two friends, but no, it really is that you've got a secret.
Okay. Yeah, that is what it is. Spouse, does your spouse look at it? I
am not, no. I mean, I feel like, yeah, I've spoken with a lot of other fellow novelists about this thing. I mean, some people do have like very literary relationships with their partners. For me, like what I want from my partner is not feedback on my work. I want like unconditional love and support. And she's a very great critic and has a great reading eye, my wife. And so I would rather not. She saw the book when it was done.
Oh, wow. And I mean, love and support in a house when you're a parent is that you get time. The spouse helps you get the time, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. I can't these days. If I write a short article or sometimes even an email, I say, Michelle, I need you to look at this before I hit send. I don't know. Is it right? And then she'll be like, yeah, it's fine. It's usually doesn't work out to be too arduous a process. But anyway, no, it's wonderful. For those listening, I'm going to ask you, and it's a little bit of laziness, but it's also in the interest of accuracy and not misrepresenting things. Sean, can you do us all a favor and summarize in your own words what maybe the book is sort of about, per se? Can you do this? Yeah.
Yeah. So, Do You Remember Being Born is a book about a 75-year-old famous poet, imaginary poet. Her name is Marianne Farmer. Wait, not Marianne Farmer. Now I'm getting confused already. Her name is Marian Farmer.
Marian.
I say Marianne because her character and parts of her life were inspired by a real-life poet called Marianne Moore, a 20th century poet. But this is Marian Farmer. Mm-hmm. And Marian Farmer receives a letter in the mail from a big tech company who offer her an enormous pile of money to come to California and for 1 week collaborate with their new cutting-edge poetry AI and to create what they describe as the first great human AI poetic collaboration. And so the book follows her 7 days in California and working on this poem, trying to decide, grappling with that question of whether she should do it. Can she do it? How can she do it? And at the same time reflecting on episodes in her life that brought her to this point.
Well put, and that for those listening, that obviously it's a brief summary. It doesn't quite capture. It doesn't capture the depth and emotion in the book. Obviously, it was really remarkable. It really moved me. It accompanied me on a vacation, and I enjoyed it very much. You alluded to Marianne Moore, the real life inspiration. In your acknowledgments, you even cite a New Yorker review that came out in 2013, a review of a book, a biography of Marianne Moore called Holding On Upside Down. Let's just so you've talked about what the book is sort of about, but why? Why did this story of Marianne Moore compel you, just this biography and her very fascinating life based on, I by the way, Sean knows this, but when I got to the acknowledgments and read that Sean was inspired by this New Yorker book review, I read the review. I found it on the internet, and I was like, oh, I get it. I totally get it. But Sean, from your perspective and in your own words, why Marianne Moore? Why did this figure appeal to you and inspire you to try to write a fictionalized account of her?
Well, the way I always think of the novels that I've written is like that they're this kind of accumulation of inspirations, of bits and bobs and threads and spools of thread and seashells and emeralds and vinyl records and all the kind of different bits and pieces of things that eventually you have a little like tableau of elements, and you sort of get a sense of how you might tell some longer story using many of those pieces as kind of inspirational material. And this book had its start kind of from two main pieces. One was AI. And so all of us have had, or almost all of us have had this experience by now in 2023 of engaging with this new generation of text-based AIs like ChatGPT, so-called large language models. But back in 2019, early 2019, I kind of stumbled across access into, an earlier version of, it was called GPT-2, there were websites that let you play with it a little bit that weren't well known. except maybe in certain circles. And I stumbled into this sort of one of these sites where you could, enter some sentences and then it would continue what you had written. And I was just really provoked by this thing. It was what the stuff it was spitting back at me was, at times nonsense, at times banal and superficial, but at other times like deeply, unsettlingly delightful or weird or alien or appealing. Or it was kind of all of these things. And I was showing it to kind of everyone I would see and thinking about the implications for this. It was the first time I had ever seen like AI related writing that seemed to engage at the level of art in a way that was sort of complementary to what humans did. Here suddenly was an AI being able to spit out some sentences that could be actually compelling. And that unsettled my understanding of some things, or started making me question them. So I had these experiences, and I was thinking about AI and all of that. And then with that kind of in the background, I read this article that you referred to by Dan Chiasson in the New Yorker about Marianne Moore. And Marianne Moore I had heard of, but didn't really know about. And this article kind of lays out some of the broad strokes of her life. And so she was a famous poet, which is in this day and age, even like kind of a contradiction in terms. She was a truly famous poet. She was born in the 1870s. She was celebrated for her work, starting in her 20s and 30s, but actually became a celebrity in her 50s and 60s. Yeah. And the kind of celebrity, public intellectual celebrity that American culture still permitted in the mid 20th century with figures like William F. Buckley or Gore Vidal. So Marianne Moore was sort of a wisecracking, fascinating woman who often wore a tricorn hat and a cape and had a deep knowledge of all kinds of things and loved baseball and threw the first pitch at a Yankees game and wrote the liner notes for a Muhammad Ali album and, was on the cover of magazines and all these things, while still being like a very serious and kind of profound poet, engaging with other poets like Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot, being an inspiration for Elizabeth Bishop. She was on The Tonight Show. I think it was Belafonte hosted her on The Tonight Show. So kind of living with one foot in both of these worlds of the very serious, abstract, and artful, and the kind of public. And there were other interesting elements of her past. She lived with her mother until her mother died of old age. So they lived together in a Manhattan apartment, just these two women for her mother's whole life, and in fact slept in the same bed.
Yeah.
And Marianne Moore never married or had children. So I had these questions about that strange relationship. But I was also tickled when I learned about this now notorious episode with Marianne Moore and the Ford Motor Car Company.
Yeah.
So Ford, the car maker. And Ford contacted Marianne Moore out of the blue in 1955 and basically asked her if she wanted to help them name their new car. And rather than wave away this sort of capitalist, commercial, trifling, superficial idea, she was tickled by it. The idea to be able to name a major consumer product was, I think, too tantalizing to such a poet like her. And so she spent several months corresponding with them, sending them lists of potential names. And some of them are just amazing. Yeah. So names like Utopian Turtletop, the Ford Utopian Turtletop, the Ford Mongoose Civic, the Ford Relentless Bullet, the Ford Pastelogram. And I just thought there was something so telling and interesting about that example of an artist, a quote unquote genius solitary artist, being tempted into engaging with kind of the enemy or an enemy, which is to say like just mass commercial product. And with all of that in mind, these things kind of started to mix together, and it was a sort of muddled ideas that ended up feeding this idea of a poet not unlike Marianne Moore being kind of tickled enough, curious enough about an invitation, a kind of commercial offering, that she says yes to trading away some of her, prestige and maybe even some of her talent in exchange for the chance to work with what she could, to do something that she could only do with the help of a giant corporation.
It's a bit confusing in that both the character and perhaps the actual poet, Marianne Moore, may have been flattered to know that their skill set was actually being acknowledged by these companies. Like their language arts it's not something to be dismissed. It was being acknowledged. And yet in the book, I think it's being acknowledged and for harvesting purposes, for knowledge creation, for the machines. It's anyway, is that what you're reading of it?
Well, I mean, maybe not. But I mean, I think that the fundamental thing is that in our world of giant corporations that loom like giants, like titans, astride the earth, it's naive to ever think that we as artists can kind of stand up to them in single-handed combat and in some ways are their rivals. Like the game is rigged, Yeah. And so this book doesn't go into deeply into, as you say, some sort of sinister, like, and in the end, her work was just being used to feed the machine. But I think it does kind of reckon with that being true. Like, that's definitely also true. No matter what's going on, that is part of what is happening. This isn't just a giant corporation suddenly being interested in exploring the bounds of truth and beauty and in the world.
Well, and I want to be very mindful of not spoiling anything for people who are going to read this book. But you've alluded to sort of this man-machine poem dynamic that is going on in your book. And one of the things, and again, I have currently an ARC. For those who don't know, that's an advanced reading copy. There can be mistakes. There can be all sorts of issues there. But as I'm reading, you tell me, Sean, if this is a mistake. So as I'm reading the book, when Marion is interacting with the AI, Charlotte, Charlotte is its name. That's the name the creators gave the AI thing. When Charlotte speaks, the text is shaded. And as they collaborate on a poem together, the book will indicate that when Marian's speaking, it's not shaded, and when Charlotte's speaking, it's shaded. So you can see who's sort of writing what part of the poem. And this is where I don't want to spoil things, and also want to be careful this is not some sort of printing error. As the book continues, and they're outside of their poetry sessions, the reader encounters shading almost any time, or rather, in a lot of instances when Marion is reciting things or describing things, some of the text is shaded, which you've already been conditioned as the reader to understand is Charlotte. So then you're like, who's feeding who? What's the twist going to be? As it happened, I'm like, something's happening to Marion now. First of all, Sean, please clarify that it's not some printing error. And secondly, what was the meaning there from your perspective of having them influence each other in such a way?
So, I mean, there's definitely the book doesn't harbor some grand twist. However, because of the experiments I'd been doing with with GPT-2, I realized that instead of just writing a book about a poet working with an AI that's purely theoretical and fictional, sort of like writing a book about, someone moving to Mars, because of the moment in which I was working, my book in turn could itself be infiltrated by AI in a similar way to the way Marian's work might be, you could say, infiltrated by AI.
Oh.
And so early on, I made a decision that my book would incorporate text generated by AI.
Oh.
And I didn't want to kind of introduce this on page 1 to contextualize that for the reader. I wanted the reader to have a version of the experience you're describing of this feeling of the reality sliding around, this unsettledness of wait, is this contaminated by this? Has Sean's book, this narrative, because it's what you're saying is the chats when Marion and Charlotte are chatting, it's clear, okay, computer talking, human talking, computer talking. But then there's other portions where Marion is writing in the first person. And then there's also some peculiar passages where Marion seems to be writing in the second person, remembering. And I wanted to introduce some slipperiness, wobbliness about where that work came from, and kind of make complicate things. Because it's also like, to me, one of the things I really want a reader of my book to come away with is like an understanding that the challenge that AI poses, in my view, to art, one of the challenges, besides like, say, money, is the software is getting good. And what does it mean to our conception of artistic creativity, artistic genius, works of art, if it is contributed to, offset by, contaminated by computer-generated stuff? And so I wanted my book to include interesting or even good interventions at time that came from a machine, not just bad stuff.
Yeah, fair enough. And now my mind is blown. That you and so I thought it was a narrative device, and in a sense it is.
Yeah,
but
it is.
It's you using the AI.
Yeah,
AI.
so truly, all of anything that's in kind of the not in chat font, but in any of the first person writing that is shaded was genuinely generated by AI and edited by me. And then also all of Charlotte's poetry, any poetry that appears in the book as invented by Charlotte, was stuff that I worked on with AI.
Again, mind blown. Thank you for that insight. I don't think that's indicated any other way. So I appreciate that, unless I missed something.
There's a reference in the author's note, but it's a bit confusing to wrap your head around.
Yeah. Okay. I might have been sun-soaked as I was on vacation by that point. I did read the review, as I said, but maybe I missed that. I want to ask you about randomness in language. Some 20 years ago, Lee Ronaldo, the guitarist and musician, some people would know him best from Sonic Youth, but he's done lots of work on his own and continues to. Lee published a poetry book based on spam emails he was receiving. And I think they were primarily like at the time, it was quite in fashion for people to receive spam specifically about pharmaceutical companies and things like that. But as he got them, and I think, and I don't want to speak on Lee's behalf here, I talked to him about it at the time. I think this was literally 2003, 4, 5, 6, something like that. And he said he was just struck by the language that these spam bots were formulating, the sentences, the words, and he would break them apart and adapt them and create ostensibly spam poetry. And I maybe didn't think it at the time, but I think he was grappling with the randomness of the collection of words, and in his mind that had a poetic quality to it. And I think for some people, poetry is on the page can be very random. And I think for some other people in 2023, AI, Chat, GPT, they seem random. They seem like they're just grabbing things. Like you said yourself, when you've first fooled around with it in 2019, it would be banal, it would be nonsensical, or I don't know if you said profound, but I gather every once in a while you would pick up on something. And that's evident in this book. Can we talk a little bit about from your viewpoint anyway, as a literary person, the seeming randomness of poetry as it relates to what we're all going through right now with these new, seemingly, they've been around a while, but these new things, this new technology. Is randomness something that interests you in terms of how people use language, how poetry is formed, how ChatGPT and all these things work? Do you know where I'm coming from there?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I mean, this makes me think of two different things. One is a technological parameter called temperature. So modern AI, large language model, ChatGPT-like things, there's a setting called temperature inside them. And some of these AIs that you play with allow you to modify the temperature, to raise it it starts at 0 and goes up to 1. So as high as 1.0. when an AI, so all of these large language models, what they do is they're trying to predict the next word in a string. So if you've written, one day I went to the, and then click generate, it's trying to guess what word should come after the. And things like ChatGPT have their randomness or their temperature, which is sort of like randomness, set very low. And so when you write, one day I went to the, it's going to come up with, I don't know, 10 or 100 or 1,000 possibilities of of what the next word can be. And the lower the temperature, the more likely it is going to choose the very top result. So one day I went to the store, if that's the most likely, if the temperature is set to 0 or to 0.1, it will definitely write store. One day I went to the store. And if you set temperature up very high, like to 0.9, then the system is more free to choose make a less likely choice. So one day I went to the circus, or one day I went to the moon. And so with some of these tools, you literally can play with, do I want an unlikely answer, or do I want a likely answer? And so ChatGPT in particular has its temperature actually turned down very low because they want it to be sort of truthful and predictable and bland. They don't want, when you say, how do you cook a scrambled egg? You don't want them to say like, well, take a hammer, like step 1, grab a hammer. They want it to be kind of predictable and bland. When I was working with these tools, one of the challenges was trying to configure them so that the temperature could be higher, because my preference as a writer of fiction and I like, stylized fiction that has a literary style. It means you don't always choose the most obvious word. You don't always choose the most obvious way that a sentence or a story could go. And to me, there was something sort of provocative about the idea that AI could, like, literally, there's like a knob that basically makes things more stylistically interesting or less stylistically interesting. So that's one piece. And I would say that some of the criticisms we see of text generated by AI in most of the free public consumption, easy stuff, people should be careful about saying, oh, the AI is bland or dumb or boring or can't do style, because the reason it's struggling so much is that its temperature setting is locked in at something very low. And if you were to play with some of this software where you can control the temperature more, you'd see it actually can be quite graceful and agile. Graceful is the wrong word, but more agile in terms of mimicking style. So
some of the jokes I've seen at the expense of some of the AI generated text is how blunt and sort of socially tactless it can be.
Yeah.
And it seems it's more honest in a weird way.
Oh, that's true as well. Someone like Nick Cave, though, has written more than once now about how this is like garbage and it can't copy his style at all. And I read this and I mean, some of his statements are just naive, because asking ChatGPT to write a Nick Cave song, it's just not good at that task. But if you take one of these other AIs, configure it correctly, and feed in some Nick Cave lyrics, it absolutely can give him this like weird funhouse mirror version of his work that mostly would be probably abhorrent to him and to me, but at times might also be fascinating. And the other thing I want to say about randomness, though, is there are a couple beats in the book where I meditate on this. Humans are very good at making meaning of like interpreting, finding meaning in. That's why you see an abstract painting and you can make some meaning of it, or even, a sketch drawing. You can say, oh, that's somebody's face. A caricature is somebody's face, even though it looks nothing like a photograph. Yeah. Or, the sound of a guitar can be, that's very angry or that's very peaceful, when there's nothing inherent to these sound waves that communicates emotion. We're very good at kind of imagining meaning and feeling into stuff. And that's beautiful, and it's the foundation of art, in my view, and maybe even to civilization. But at times, working with AI made me confront the idea that that's, in some ways, this kind of weird liability or weakness if we're really obsessed with like human superiority, human exclusive, like the magic, ineffable magic power of human imagination over some machine-made thing. So, because one of the criticisms of AI is like, it's random. And certainly it's literally statistically, like kind of not semi-random, but probabilistic. If you ask the large language model, I went to it's just going to be choosing based on what the most likely responses are.
Yeah.
But if I were to write in, the moon in the sky looked like and then asked it to, it might say looked like a circle, looked like a ball of ice, it might give you sort of predictable, uninteresting answers. And then it might give you wrong kind of answers. The moon looked like cheese. The moon looked like television or something like that. But occasionally those wrong things can be really fascinating.
But you talked about how we met at the Dawson City, or sorry, I said we talked about the Dawson City Music Festival, and that's I established that's really where we met. I think we met in Whitehorse, by the way, because you reached out when there was a stopover, and you were like,
"Oh right,
Vish, I'm friends with Kit," and blah blah blah. But we were both there, among other reasons we were there. But we were kind of known for covering underground music, for lack of a better term. This temperature discussion you're talking about is really fascinating. To me, it's fascinating. I wonder if you see a correlation between I went to the store being maybe something you would hear, and I'm being very reductive here. I went to the store, you would hear maybe in a song on, let's say, mainstream radio. I went to the moon, you might hear on a Nick Cave album. You might hear on underground radio. Are we programmed? And I can't explain how I'm programmed or why I'm wired to go to the moon lyric before I accept the store lyric as being as good or as interesting. I can't explain it to you. There's just something in my fundamental foundation that drew me to being like, no. The store is boring. The moon is interesting. I want to hear that song. Do you see a correlation between how we've been programmed or are programmed? I'm talking in this case, Sean, you and me. Where our predilections and idiosyncrasies seem to be when it comes to what we want to consume and what we want to champion versus what other people do. Do you see any connection between how we tend to live and appreciate art versus what's kind of happening in this book and what's kind of happening in culture with AI and what it all means? Sorry, is that too convoluted?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. It's weird, isn't it? Because you've got this character, Marion, too, who's a snob. I mean, she's a snob about poetry. Like she's an established poet, and she doesn't trust this machine to know what it's doing. And I mean, gradually, and also, again, no spoilers, like eventually, I won't explain exactly how she gets to the point where she completes the project, because it's not, I'll leave it at that. Anyway, sorry, back to my point. Do you relate to AI? That temperature thing?
Yeah, I do. Like, that's part of the spookiness is like, there's this moment where Marion's reflecting on something Charlotte has written, and she's like, "Oh, this is garbage." Yeah. And then she's like, "Oh, wait, or maybe it's just hold on, maybe it's really good." Oh, no, it's garbage. And to me, like, that's funny, but it's also like not unlike what I do when I'm at my desk writing a sentence of a short story. Is this constant, like, the more kind of surprising your choices are, which is the heart of, good literature isn't just like the most surprising choice of words, but it's this funny kind of tension between surprise and expectation and this kind of dance. Yeah. But a lot of the time I'm, writing a sentence and I have no idea whether what I've written is good or terrible, and whether the choice to use an unusual word is, the classic version of this is just like writers, when you're learning to write, you write dialogue and you say, so what do you think Vish said? Well, this is what I think Sean said. Yeah. And then there's like a certain moment of like the amateur or like the student writer who starts replacing said with like sneered, giggled, shuddered, like this, all these weird synonyms, exclaimed. And then you're told, because it seems to make the work loftier and more grown up. And then hopefully a writing teacher says, or you just notice from reading enough books, like, no, we have a convention in English where we don't do that, where we mostly just use said or nothing at all. Yeah. And so sometimes you're reading something back and I'll spend 10 minutes trying to decide if I really should say shouted or if I should use an exclamation mark and no, something like that.
This is a book about collaboration, though, too.
Yes,
very much so. Yeah. So you've got an esteemed figure who knows and has every reason to believe she knows what she's doing, collaborating with not only a machine in Charlotte, but also younger aspiring poets. And in Marion's case, like with the example you cited of her not being sure if what Charlotte has generated is good or not, but it's part of the same project. Like they're working on something together. So she's got to I came up with the thing that is launching this thing to do this thing, which is often what teachers do when they're working with a student. Have you ever collaborated with someone in such a way, Sean, where you're like trading prose back and forth?
I've tried. I've done some projects that have been collaborative, and I've performed improv, which is like the most collaborative, creative thing I've done. But I know why I haven't like written a book with somebody else. That sounds very challenging. But I think you're touching on something that I think is really important. One of the kind of possible answers I started coming to as I thought about this question of, the technology and art is it keeps being formulated in this way of like, will we let the robots replace us? And this kind of zero-sum game of replacement strikes me as actually being really not the only way that we could conceive of this. Obviously, the economic stuff is sort of separate, but the more I started thinking about the way that art making is this collaboration, a collaboration with the artists that came before us, collaboration with the people who built the tools that we use, collaboration with our peers and our inspirations, the less dangerous AI, less lethal AI felt to me. And then that started to kind of cloud in with some of my other thoughts also about just the way that our obsession with a certain kind of artistic genius, of like solitary genius, the idea of that novelists like me, you kind of want to hermetically seal yourself away from the world so that the divine angel of inspiration can visit you and not let yourself be corrupted by the real world and all this stuff. And it's like, the way we forgive so many famous artists for being awful human beings because that's what they needed to do for their art. And I kind of call BS on a lot of those claims. And certainly I think that a richer, happier life and a more fertile art is made when you are engaging with the world and collaborating in a sense with the people in your life, or maybe with other artists and younger artists. And I wanted to kind of make that part of this book too, where it's the story of a celebrated older poet who has spent her whole life trying to kind of form a little like nest, a little eyrie for herself in some high tower so that she can make her work, because she thinks that's the only way it can be done, when really it's one of the most kind of emaciated ways that one can be an artist is by hiding away in that way.
It's fascinating to read Marion encountering some of the scientists as the poem is progressing and as progress is being made. Marion is sort of put in a position where she's watching these men, mostly men, who are scientists, read the works in progress, and they weep. They weep because that's an interesting thing, because I think as the reader, you're like, well, they're weeping because they invented a robot and the robot is working. But then the other side of it is they're weeping because the art is moving them, perhaps. I will say I'm more on the former. Like, I feel like they're like, our baby is actually working.
Yeah.
But then you've got this knot of them being exposed to, for whatever it's worth, poetry is viewed. I don't know. I feel like there's a commentary here on how poetry is actually viewed and processed by people, particularly scientists. Yeah. Those of us who maybe come from English studies backgrounds are like, yeah, poetry is very moving. It's very integral. And it's just fascinating to me that you chose, of all the language forms to center this kind of story around, you chose poetry, which for some people is maybe one of the most inaccessible. I was just talking to a Fen Lilly. Do you know this artist, Fen Lilly, from the musician? Oh man, you
don't
gotta
think
check
so.
out her album Big Picture. It came out on Dead Ocean. She was just on the show. It came out on Dead Oceans. Sean, one of my favorite records of the year. Lyrics are fantastic. She's great. Anyway, we were talking about sleeping and exercise and stress and how she's trying to sleep more. And she said, these days, to get myself to sleep, I'm reading poetry. And she has this background of just immersing herself in poets, but she says it really helps her center herself and fall asleep. I think a lot of people find poetry to be dream-inducing or boring or numbing or something. So I just want to say, and you know, do you have a background in poetry yourself? I know you as a prose writer. Okay. Any particular reason you chose poetry? Of all the things you could choose in terms of written expression, why poetry?
I remember, so my last book, The Wagers, is partly a book about making art making. And I remember one of the things I liked was I made the decision, I'm like, I want to write a book about kind of being an artist. But of course, I don't want to write a book about like write a book about a poet, like make it so clearly loftily about art, like the loftiest form of art making. So instead I made it about a stand-up comic, which struck me as like being the most shabby, disrespectful, like irrespectful, unrespectful, and unrespectable kind of artist, you know, barely an artist in the view of some people. And so I could write a book about being an artist by making it about a stand-up comic. It kind of conceals some of that. And I think there was something sort of perverse in me that after I would never want to write a book about being an artist, like as a poet, to then be like, okay, now let's grapple with the poet, because the poet does have this symbolic place in our culture as both the most eminent example of artistic something,
right,
while also being kind of not garnering the respect or kind of being seen as non-useful in a way that's kind of provocative and interesting.
Yeah, and this comes at a time where almost any person who expresses their thoughts is viewed with some disdain. Any expertise is sort of mocked, and anyway, it's a very weird time. And but this book comes to us rather at a. Yeah, it's just an interest. Do you feel like we're at a crossroads? Like, are you? Sorry, I meant to ask you this earlier as you were talking about your explorations. Like, do you yourself embrace AI? Because as we're speaking, Sean, there has been a massive strike between the Writers Guild and the Actors Guild. They've joined forces, and they are buckled down in this strike. It could be over by the time people hear this, if the year is 2025. I don't think it's going anywhere.
No,
but one of the
soon, no.
primary points of contention is the use of AI. The studios want to use it more. The writers in particular, and the actors, actually, what am I talking about? They're trying to actually replicate people's faces using this technology so that the acting can go on into infinity, even long after these actors are actually gone. Sorry, a lot of context for this question, but given how much you've explored and fiddled with AI, do you embrace it as a writer yourself? Like, do you see this as something we should be embracing, as opposed to like Nick Cave derisively saying, this isn't working?
Well, I think that we should be posing questions about this that are more thoughtful and curious than just like, is this going to take money out of my pocket? I would be surprised if my next book involves AI, like in its making, but I would also be surprised if there was a novelist, or there were very many novelists in 25 years who are making books without drawing on some kind of AI tools a little bit. I think about the way that, you know, whenever we take a photograph on our phones or our gizmos and use that magic wand tool to like beautify it, people aren't having this like major moment of hesitation being like, should I do this, involve an AI? And why shouldn't I use my human creativity to modify the color saturation on this? I'm in a large part, and I think it's just the tools are kind of useful enough that they become integrated into life, and I think that that's going to happen with a lot of AI tools. And I also think two things can be true. One is that studios or publishers or whatever are trying to creators,
Yeah.
and also that those creators are kind of misunderstanding some of the challenges. Like I remember, I'm sure you heard like some of the actors' rants against AI use of scanning their faces. Like I heard a Mark Maron rant recently. My impression is that it's like he's very mistaken in that the studios will not have, you have in America, at least, I don't know actually the Canadian laws as well. You have control, ownership over your likeness. Nobody can take, someone can't release a Drake song without Drake's permission because he has this right to own one's likeness without. And so I think some of the worries are a little bit like incorrect.
Well, I will, but I think first of all, Mark Maron is often incorrect. Secondly, I think that what we're getting to is it's been a long-standing thing that the emulation of something is actually good enough for the general public, and they won't even notice the difference. How many of us have been watching television, those of us who, or YouTube or whatever, and still encounter a commercial, and the music is so familiar. It's so much, and I hesitate to say his name, but like I can't go a week without hearing a television commercial that doesn't sound like a Kanye West production. Like almost exactly,
Yes.
except it's just a little different, so they don't have to pay. And how many how many lawsuits have occurred over the years saying this is actually copying me, or this is too close to what I did.
Exactly, but I also think that artists should not let their curiosity, and they shouldn't allow this conversation to solely be a conversation of like, what will we do about the like crappiest art that's being made.
Sure.
And that might take, we might have more of this crappy stuff that is made by machines that like at the lowest mass market end of.
But I think the defensive fear is
stuff.
that it will be as good. And that it will actually fool enough people. I think that's what's going to happen. I think when you hear Nick Cave or Mark Maron or whomever rant about it, I think it's defensiveness. And I'm not saying that's bad. I'm saying like I'm saying they're probably like, I need to defend what makes me special, what makes my brethren special. And if they're if they're just experimenting with this, and we're all laughing at these emulations of a stand-up comedy joke or an emulation of a Nick Cave song, the more that's done, I think these people, the creators, know that it will get closer and closer and closer until it's the general public. As time passes, we might forget someone published it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. But I think those artists are selling art short.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a classic comedy line about comedy, which is like, if someone else could tell this joke, it's not really yours.
Right.
It's how valuable is a joke if anybody else could tell it.
Yeah.
And I think there's some of that where, which is where I land. I think that artists should appreciate that there's a wellspring of some. I remember hearing with kind of a certain chill the idea that AI had been trained on some Bach, like 5-piece choral music. So Johann Sebastian Bach, these choral pieces. And so it was this crazy thing that you could give, if you could teach a computer the 4 parts of the first 4 voices in a choir, and then ask it to generate the 5th voice. And it was actually a really easy thing to train a computer to do, because you could have the actual 5th voice. You could take a 5-voice Bach thing, and you could be like, guess what the first note of the 5th voice is, and if it was the one that Bach chose, correct. If the one not the one he chose, wrong. Yeah. So you can train these machines on this, and so suddenly you had this AI that could like simulate Bach. Oh my God. But of course, the only reason it could simulate that is that you had all this Bach, that Bach invented this form of beautiful music that you could feed it on. And so similarly, like if an AI can generate some garbagey like version of Kanye West's original early stuff, then I think it's only going to make more precious and valuable, and obviously precious and valuable, the inventive work that an AI could never do.
I mean, guitars were invented whenever they were invented, and somehow people use them and they have the exact same keys. Sorry, that's the wrong term to use. That's too confusing. Yeah. everyone has the same access point to the chords, the basic chords, and then they go wherever they go. And every once in a while, you will hear someone say, you took my progression from 50 years ago and made it into your own thing, and I don't like that, and I want to be compensated for that at the very least, or credited. But it is kind of remarkable. You know, the drum kits are, lots of things are kind of, they get invented, we figure them out, humans do, and then people make their own things with them. Like, it's the exact same thing.
If someone picks up a saxophone, a saxophonist picks up their saxophone and they hear, wait, somebody else was playing the saxophone? Were they using any other thing? No, just the saxophone. Like, a great saxophonist isn't going to be like, oh no, I'm ruined.
Yes, that's true.
They're going to say, well, get a load of this,
yes,
you know?
Yes, there's still room to innovate within all of this stuff and find a voice, I guess. I think maybe you swayed me. I wasn't sure where I was landing on this argument, but I think it's maybe still early days.
But yeah, I think if your form of art, if you're an artist and your main form of art is writing like really garbagey coloring books that are sold at the dollar store, like, look out.
Yes, yes.
You know.
But if the temperature is adjusted, you might get a really beautiful coloring book in the end of it. Anyway, it's just I'm fascinated by all of this. Sean, I hope we didn't do a disservice to the book. Do you think we talked?
Me too.
I just wanted to give people. I'm sorry. I'm mindful of spoiling novels on my show, and I don't want to say too much about it, other than to be exuberant about it. I really love it. It's really another wonderful book, and it's another example of you taking, I guess, factual figures and adapting them into fantastical ways that I find really compelling. So is there anything more you want to say about the book that we didn't get to? I hate to put it's my interview. I hate to put the burden on you, but is there anything you want to say before we wrap up here?
Well, I would say, it's out on September 5th, and I'm going to be traveling around a bit. I'll be in Vancouver and San Francisco and Montreal and Toronto and Halifax and Austin, Texas. And I would love, if anyone listens to this show and is in those places and comes on out, I'd love to talk to anyone more about any of these things.
I have a larger American audience than I do a Canadian one. So I hope people in those cities hear what you have to say. If people want to learn more about you and this book, Sean, where would you like to direct them on the AI-based internet?
Yeah, just go into ChatGPT. No, don't. My website is byseanmichaels.com, or you can find me on Twitter at Swan Michaels, swan like the bird.
Okay. And by the way, we've sort of touched upon music a little bit here and there. Is any said the gramophone things? Are you still working on sort of music writing and whatnot?
I do bits and pieces of things here and there, but not. I've really been busy with this. So
okay. So,
yeah.
All right. So we'll check out your website. You also, you alluded to what your next book may or may not be. Are you already working on something?
What did we say about secrets?
Well, you can.
Chat? Yeah.
I don't expect details. I'm just doing a wellness check. Are you able to?
Yeah, no, well, I mean, I think that's correct. I'd be very grumpy if I didn't have something to work on. So yeah, I do have a bit of something to work on.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. Well, I as you know, I'm a big fan of you. I love you, Sean. Thank you for making time for me. Yeah. And again, everyone check out, Do You Remember Being Born? It's really a wonderful novel. And, Sean, thanks again for your support of me and my show and my work and for being back with me. And, we'll talk soon, and best of luck in the future.
My pleasure. Have a great day.
Well, I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Sean Michaels there about his new book, Do You Remember Being Born? And I hope you'll pick it up for yourself. Order a copy, buy a copy at your local bookstore, ask your library to stock it, whatever you got to do. It's a wonderful book. And again, Sean, thanks for being on the 798th episode of Creative Control, which is part of the Entertainment One podcast network and is available just about wherever you get your podcasts. If you're having trouble locating an episode that you've heard about, or you want to learn more about me and sign up for my monthly newsletter, please visit vishkhanna.com. You can like Creative Control on Facebook or follow me and the show on social media. We are still on Twitter at Vish Creative, or you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Vishkana, and you can also find me on some of the other things like Blue Sky and Mastodon and whatever. I don't know. I'm on the things. You just have to find me, and hopefully you find the right me. Also, please visit patreon.com/creative control to make a flexible monthly donation to sustain this podcast. A reminder that $6 American or more a month grants you access to some exclusive content. And if you're interested in receiving a Creative Control t-shirt, just message me on Patreon and I'll get you one while supplies last. I just received such a message last night. It's coming to my memory right now. So I have to dig into that and find out what this kind person wants, and I will send them a shirt. Anyway, you can learn more about how to do all of those things and get a shirt at patreon.com/creative control. Thank you in advance for considering that. Speaking of thank yous, I want to thank Pizza Trocadero, The Bookshelf, and Planet Bean Coffee in Guelph, Ontario, and Granddad's Donuts in Hamilton, Ontario, for their long time and in-kind support for this show. Also want to thank my dear friend Jim Guthrie for letting me use some music of his on this show each week. You can learn more about Jim at jimguthrie.org. And finally, thank you so much for listening to this episode with Shawn Michaels. Again, I hope you will keep tabs on Shawn's work. Go to his website. I've linked to a bunch of stuff in the show notes here, but this book is wonderful. Do You Remember Being Born? So I hope you'll check that out. I hope you will subscribe to this podcast or tell your friends all about it and spread the word about Creative Control. And otherwise, I just hope you're well and that we talk soon. All right? Be well. Take care. Bye for now.